Hello and welcome back to Perspectives. On today's show, Narendra Modi's European tour was hit by a little shades of chaos, let's call it. Well, we're going to take you back to Oslo, where a wonderful Norwegian journalist threw that sharp question that rather left Narendra Modi completely silent. And that triggered an aggressive state-led media lockdown. We'll take a closer look at Hella's thoughts behind the scenes on why she asked that question. And as Washington's top diplomats rush to fix their fractured trade ties between India and the United States, we're going to ask the hard question: can the West ever truly trust India as a stable ally? Or is it time to look at, well, yes, of course, an independent Khalistan as the only real solution to Delhi's untrustworthy regime? We'll peel back the layers of India's manufactured GDP mirage to show an economy that is really structurally gasping for air. Then we're going to turn to a historic shift in Washington. Dr. Ganesha Kaur becomes the first Sikh ever appointed to USCIRF, the United States Commission for International Religious Freedoms. And that lands just as that very commission explicitly called for unprecedented sanctions against the RSS and RAW, and of course over transnational repression. And finally, we'll look at shifting political tides in Canada over the controversial Bill C9, the Free Speech Bill. We'll cover quickly the British Sikh community's unified response to a high-profile UK murder trial, and then we'll finish on a rather beautiful, auspicious visual note from a new Sahib over in India. All this and more on today's show, and of course we'll take a look at loads of great comments at the end of the show, so do stay tuned for that. Right, as always, a lot to get through this morning. But we're going to start with the geopolitical relationship between India and the United States. We do talk about this a lot, and it is frequently hyped by mainstream media, but it's fundamentally, as it turns out, it is fracturing. It really is struggling behind closed doors, because all the evidence, there's a lot of smoke pointing to a fire that's raging behind the scenes. The volatile, and it is a very volatile relationship between the United States, President Donald Trump and Narendra Modi. It is by its very nature, it's very, very much blowing hot and cold. Now, for years, the Western establishment has peddled a highly sanitized narrative, framing New Delhi as an indispensable, rock-solid strategic ally in that region. It is, as I often say, it is this eastern bulwark against China. It is a bulwark of supposedly economic stability and, of course, as they claim, democratic values. But that ink is drying on all sort of the recent economic assessments and the recent, well, even trade deals, tariff deals, etc. that have been agreed. But the whole mask is starting to slip. There's a little bit more truth that's sort of filtering out. This is an article that was in one of the mainstream newspapers. It's slightly right-leaning, in fact, usually pro-India, that came out just a few days ago. And this, again, is just revealing that this mask is slipping. And an uncomfortable truth is really starting to come up to the surface. India, under the Modi regime, is proving to be a highly volatile and untrustworthy partner. And this isn't just obviously coming from Perspectives and our show. This is actually now the same view, because we, of course, as always, were ahead of the curve. The mainstream now just starting to pick up this sort of this feeling, this sense, this perspective themselves, that this highly policed, highly controlled veneer of state-sponsored propaganda coming out from India is hiding really a very different truth. And when you do strip away these choreographed hugs at bilateral summits and you know, the warm handshaking, even the embraces, there's a much harder, more, as I say, more volatile reality behind what's going on. And the hard data is showing a very different story. The strategic partnership between Washington and New Delhi is not built on shared democratic principles, as we often say. Really, and because of Donald Trump, it is a transactional relationship. In other words, it's all about business. And it is a deeply unstable arrangement that is built on sand and built on shifting sand, as I actually went into detail in one of the other shows earlier last week. And to understand the depth of this friction, we've got to look directly at Donald Trump himself and his aggressive, hyper-transactional approach to international trade. He is a businessman. He's a deal maker. He's less of a politician, more of a deal maker, and that is how he approaches these sorts of relationships. And Trump doesn't view foreign policy through the traditional way that other leaders tend to, through some sort of lens of traditional diplomatic loyalty or not wanting to upset people through diplomacy, or even permanent ideological alliances. Remember, I said some time ago, Trump does things very differently. He tends to rip up the rule book and rewrite it in his own form, because he views the world strictly through the lens of trade, of balance sheets, trade deficits, reciprocal tariffs, numbers, deals. He's a businessman. That's how he approaches these things. So the historical trajectory, the trend over the last 12 months, really perfectly illustrates this volatility. Last year, for example, the relationship between US and India neared a total crisis point when Trump, Washington, slapped huge, punishing, unprecedented tariffs, 50% tariffs on Indian imports. It's never been seen before. It was itself a sweeping move, deliberately designed to penalise New Delhi, primarily because it just wouldn't stop buying discounted Russian oil. And of course, with the the Russian-Ukrainian war going on, Washington wanted to stop Moscow from selling its oil to feed the Ukrainian war machine, or the war machine fighting Ukraine, and to stop India buying Russian oil. So the Trump administration managed to force a really tense conditional interim trade agreement earlier this year, after those huge 50% tariffs. And that interim trade agreement was sort of a first stepping stone towards trying to change the relationship between the US and India, obviously in the US interest. And they lowered that tariff from 50% down to 18%. But that was in exchange for India committing to buy $500 billion worth of US energy, tech, aircraft, etc. over 5 years. It was a deal. It was a business deal. We will remove those tariffs or reduce those massive tariffs in exchange for you buying $500 billion worth of our goods and services. And what that implies is it's no longer about, if it ever was, about shared values. It's about trade. It's about business deals. But ultimately, what that points to is that underlying trust is fundamentally broken. That's the key issue. In other words, it actually is not just about pure business deals. The implication is the trust is gone. It's just become simply transactional. We do not trust your supposedly democratic values. And just this week, US Secretary of State Marco Rubio landed in India on his pretty high-stakes tour. It's a 3-day tour. He's visiting Kolkata, Jaipur, New Delhi. It is an urgent diplomatic mission that's explicitly designed to try and patch up these severe structural tears in the fabric of the relationship of India and the United States. But, and you can see here, I've set out just a sort of a brief timeline of the sort of that tide swinging backwards and forwards in the relationship. But Rubio, even whilst he's there trying to smooth over these massive cracks in the relationship, Trump's core trade advisors, people like Peter Navarro, they're continuing to direct abrasive, dismissive language towards India's protectionist economic model. And again, this is a problem that India has, and it's driven by Narendra Modi's regime. It has become, and I've said this over and over again for a few years now, India is a very protectionist market. It's let's make it in India, India for India, India trade for India, and let's shut out everybody else. Basically, there are barriers put up by Narendra Modi to stop foreign direct investment, FDI as it's called. And this, of course, is to the detriment of India. And this is why it's one of the key foundational elements why India is suffering, because it's basically trying to do it all on its own, and it's turning away foreign investment that it's needed, foreign capital to grow and develop at the speed that Narendra Modi is actually aiming for. It's just economically impossible without foreign investment. But ultimately, for Donald Trump, India isn't an exceptional ally to be protected or sheltered at all costs. Quite the opposite. It sees India as an aggressive market competitor. Trump sees India as this competitor in the world that routinely exploits American market access, but at the same time keeping its own domestic industry, its agriculture, dairy, technology sectors heavily protected behind non-tariff barriers and strict red lines. So Trump has recognised this, and he said, no, under the America First doctrine, which he's created, he's made it very clear that he will not tolerate one-sided arrangements. And he's demonstrated this since he's been in office. And India is a classic target of this protectionist regime that he abhors, particularly when it's so one-sided, where that regime benefits and America loses. So this is why Delhi has become such a target. And if New Delhi fails to deliver on its massive purchasing promises, remember that $500 billion of purchasing from the US market, or if it steps out of line geopolitically, in other words, it doesn't do what America wants, what Trump wants, well, that economic hammer is going to fall again without hesitation, and it's going to hit India hard. And this is really where it matters, because this escalating trade friction between India and America acts as a pressure test for India's internal metrics, in other words, measuring its own internal economy. Now, for months, we've been saying, and we've consistently analysed India and saying all this that we find, everything we're uncovering through the academics, through even just reading between the lines of reports, that there is a systematic manipulation going on of data, of news, of economic news. There is inflation, or at least there is misreporting of inflation. There is falsification of official Indian GDP data by the state machinery itself. And the ruling regime, Modi's regime, has consistently, basically, cooked the books, as we say. They're not telling the truth. They're using good old-fashioned statistical, what we call smoke and mirrors. It's like a magic trick. They're hiding the truth. They're trying to project an image of an unstoppable, fast-growing global superpower to attract, hopefully, ironically, foreign direct investment, FDI. But in reality, there is a protectionist racket going on, an isolationist sort of mentality in India. And secondly, the actual basic metrics, the measures of India's economy are pointing to something quite alarming. And this Washington agenda now, Trump's agenda, is actually starting to dismantle this whole mirage, this whole illusion of the Indian economy. Because when an export-dependent economy like India, facing massive domestic unemployment, which India is suddenly confronted by aggressive Western tariffs and demands for $500 billion in structural purchases. In other words, you have to spend $500 billion. That puts India a little bit on the spot, because it can then no longer hide behind cookbooks. It can't hide behind cooked domestic figures that it's basically created out of nowhere. It is a real-world slap in the face. It is a real-world clampdown that's going to strip away all those statistical nonsenses, all that padding, that fake news, the fake economic, superpower story. And it's just going to expose what's underneath. And underneath is this raw structural decay of the Indian economy. This is deeply concerning. A struggling domestic manufacturing sector, rampant inflation, severe wealth inequality, and that's an understatement. I mean, the gap between the rich and the poor in India is growing. A banking sector weighed down by corporate scandals, the billionaires on all sorts of questionable charges here in the West. Well, I refer back to the story the other day of Adani being let off by the US, but anyway, that's a different story. But anyway, to come back to this key point, the ultimate reality is that India is not thriving. It is structurally, as I said in the intro, gasping for air. The state-led effort to project external economic dominance, we are a future economic superpower, it's nothing more than a desperate PR campaign designed to mask what's going on inside. Deep internal instability. That's the key point. And again, this comes back once again to what we keep saying. You put all this together, the economic data manipulation, the unreliable foreign policy, hedging as it's called, and the complete lack of domestic transparency, it does force a very important, profound, unavoidable question for Western policymakers. And it's a question I have to keep trotting out over and over and over again, because not enough people in Western governments are asking this question. Ultimately, can the West truly trust India as a stable, long-term ally in Asia? And the empirical evidence, as we conclude over and over and over and over again, is no. A state that falsifies its own economic health, that actively suppresses basic press freedoms on the global stage and engages in aggressive transnational repression, just simply cannot serve as a reliable anchor for regional security. And obviously, within that vacuum of reliability and strategic necessity for the West, that's where an independent Khalistan just becomes blindingly clear. It is a necessity. From a completely basic, hard-headed, realistic geopolitical perspective, the establishment of a sovereign, democratic Khalistan in that region is the only viable long-term solution to the permanent untrustworthiness of an Indian state. A sovereign Sikh state, obviously rooted in the rule of law, democracy, economic transparency, and, as I say, Western-aligned values, it would act as a genuinely stable, predictable anchor right in the heart of South Asia. And of course, the question then always comes back to, well, could such a radical remapping of that region eventually appeal to Donald Trump? And appeal to his typically disruptive, highly disruptive transactional worldview? Well, it is a distinct possibility that regional analysts are probably quietly debating. Trump is a leader who openly disdains, doesn't like, hates failing, inefficient status quo institutions and multi-layered bureaucratic states that fail to deliver on their promises. And he's demonstrated that over and over and over again. If you cross his path, if he doesn't like you, he is literally prepared to send in the military if necessary. He's not afraid, but not always necessarily the military. He can hit you with an economic hammer. And if the Washington policy establishment realizes that a hyper-nationalist, unreliable India, this monolithic, single, artificial country, don't forget, it is an artificial country brought together by the British Empire. If it is completely incapable of serving as a reliable counterweight and an ally, and instead it's a highly volatile liability teaching on a manufactured economic mirage, an illusion, well, the concept of a managed structural breakup of the region starts to make logical sense. Breaking up an unreliable, unstable monopoly and replacing it with focused, highly accountable, democratic, Western-friendly sovereign states like Khalistan could suit Trump's long-term geopolitical purposes much, much better than constantly pouring diplomatic capital into propping up a deceptive, failing regime in New Delhi. And it's an argument that moves out of the realm of just simple sentiment and hope and wishes and aspirations, and actually puts it really into the arguments and the debates of raw, cold, transactional geopolitics. In other words, what's in it for me? Asked Donald Trump's regime. An awful lot. What's in it for the West? An awful lot. And these are the debates that could be and should be happening on a regular basis in the White House or wherever. We'll see. Anyway, but as I say, it's interesting that the same sentiment is now hitting the mainstream in things like the Daily Telegraph. I was quite surprised to see that, but I am seeing an increasing number of articles like this questioning India as an ally. Let's move on. Right, here we go. My favourite lady of the year so far, Helle. We covered this at the end of last week. Bless her. This Norwegian journalist. This wonderful story about press freedom. And of course, it was Prime Minister Narendra Modi's official tour of Europe. And as I reported at the end of last week, a really sort of bit of a storm in a teacup, but it was actually, in terms of journalism, it was a major clash that took place in Norway, in Oslo. And it showed the massive difference between how democratic countries treat the news media and how the Indian government tries to control it. Well, for those of you who watched last week's show, and I did show a video, and I'll show it again just to remind those and those who might not have seen that. The drama began at a joint press appearance in Oslo with the Norwegian Prime Minister, when Narendra Modi obviously had a meeting with the Prime Minister of Norway. And in these events, international leaders usually make a short speech, they take questions from reporters. But on this occasion, the Indian delegation did not allow a question and answer session. It was unusual. And as the two leaders finished the statements and they began to walk away, this wonderful lady, this brave Norwegian journalist, her name is Helle Lyng-Svendsen, did her job as she's been trained to do. She shouted a direct question at the Indian Prime Minister. Let me show you. I'm going to show you now the video of this. Here we go.
Thank you.
Prime Minister Modi, why don't you take some questions from the freest press in the world?
And this is from the BBC's angle.
Prime Minister Modi, why don't you take some questions from the freest press in the world?
Scurries out as he does. And so the BBC, interestingly, the BBC then covered the story. They were all over the story, interestingly. And the BBC has a bit of an interesting relationship with India because it has a huge presence in India. And that was the BBC Hindi channel. And it doesn't want to get thrown out of India, so it has to toe the line to a certain degree. And it got into trouble, actually, about 2 or 3 years ago, when it did a very interesting investigative piece on Narendra Modi. And they were threatened with basically being thrown out of India, so they had to sort of retract. And so, in other words, the BBC has to, they're treading a very fine line. They want to try to be a free press, try to be objective in their reporting, but ultimately, they can't go too far. They can't criticise Modi too far because, of course, they then get thrown out of India. India being really not a country with no free press as such. And this is really what this whole story is about. And there, in that clip, you heard Helle shout out, Prime Minister Modi, why do you not take questions from the world's freest press? And as we talked about before, the reason she asked that question is because India sits at 157th in the Global Free Press Index, literally in the same quartile as North Korea, as China, as Russia. But ironically, Norway is ranked number 1. Norway is the freest press in the world, according to the World Press Freedom Index. So that question really hit home and it went viral. And the beauty of it did go viral. And people have and it's woken a lot of people up. Why did she ask that question in the way? And why has it gone viral? So again, it's how powerful, just simple, literally 20 seconds of an event can really trigger so much attention. So following that viral moment, the reporter actually gave an interview to the BBC to explain exactly why she shouted that question. And the explanation is actually very simple, but it is obviously very important. A free press has a duty to ask hard questions to powerful leaders. So I'm going to play you a few excerpts from this BBC interview. from the BBC Hindi channel. And let's listen to her explain why she did it.
When we get powerful nations to our small country that is also looking to strengthen ties with us, it is our job to try to ask questions. I know that your prime minister does not like to take questions, but it was my duty to ask.
The journalists present there were not informed that there will be an interaction between the prime ministers and the journalists, right?
Because it wasn't planned. It wasn't planned. Given the situation for press freedom in India and also human rights violations, of course, it's my duty to try to ask a question to the most powerful man of this very large nation.
Yeah, good on you, Helen. And she's explaining that when a powerful global leader visits a democracy like Norway to sign business deals, reporters are duty-bound, obliged by their very profession to ask things like human rights, media freedom, press freedom. She says she knew Modi rarely faces the press, but felt it was her duty to try. And later in the interview, she made a very clear point comparing Modi to other world leaders. She said, for example, look, when French President Emmanuel Macron visited Norway, he stood at the microphone and he answered a whole series of tough questions that were thrown at him from local reporters. He didn't shy away. And that shows that true democratic leaders don't run away from the press. They are held accountable. And they know if they are a democratic leader, they must be duty-bound to be held accountable to not only the domestic press, but global press. In other words, nothing to hide, nothing to fear, to use that old maxim. Let's continue.
They come into the room and they start speaking. First, Prime Minister of Norway speaks about India and Norway and the agenda for today, strengthening ties between our two countries. And then also your Prime Minister, Modi, has his shares his beliefs and also what his aim is for this state visit. And usually during these types of press conferences in Norway, they will do the exact same thing, talk together to the press that has come today or yesterday, and then they will also take a few questions. For example, when Macron was here last year, Macron was also taking questions from Norwegian reporters. Not many, but he did take some.
And that's, where it starts getting a bit uncomfortable for India. Because she's talking about political accountability. She states in Norway, politicians are expected to stand and give clear answers. They don't just deliver rehearsed speeches. That's democracy. And the story doesn't end there because, of course, the video went viral. And she does actually, in that video, in another point, talk about human rights and the failing state of India. And I'll talk about that in a moment. But the Indian embassy, after what happened at that sort of press conference, well, it wasn't even a press conference, after that sort of staged event where she shouted a question, the Indian embassy then realised it was going viral and it was really damaging India's reputation. So they tried to control that damage. Of course, the Gaudiya media doesn't like to lose the narrative. And they invited the Norwegian press then to an official briefing, not led by Narendra Modi, but led by an Indian diplomat and a guy called Sahib George. And again, I talked about this, I just touched on this last week, but I've got a little bit more detail about this now. And actually, I've got the footage. So, of course, it was a very carefully managed event designed to try and reclaim the narrative. But things did not go according to plan. Welcome to the democratic West, India. You really can't control the narrative in the democratic West. And the Norwegian reporters all showed up and they asked specific questions. But these questions really hit in the Indian delegation with like a bit of we jokingly call it a wet fish slapped in the face, because that is essentially how it must have felt. They asked specific questions about human rights violations. They asked about media freedom in India. Questions that they're not used to facing. They certainly don't face questions like that in India. Nobody dares ask those questions in India. And of course, the result was that they panicked. They basically lost control. And instead of giving clear answers, this Sibby George started talking about ancient history, started talking about yoga, how India invented the game of chess. It actually became a little bit farcical. And when the journalist just tried to stop him, said, no, we're not asking about yoga or chess. We're asking you specific questions about human rights abuses, freedom of speech, the free press in India, or the lack of it. That's when this diplomat completely lost his temper. And I'll just show you a little clip of this. It did go on for a while, so I'll just show you a little clip of it now.
Will the Prime Minister start taking critical questions from the Indian press at some point in the future?
We have a question there.
But I might also have follow-up questions, so it would be
Please.
better if you answer
We
right
have
away and
question.
then I can follow up.
I'm conducting the press conference, so please.
Please don't interrupt me. Please don't interrupt me. You ask me a question. Please. This is my press conference.
It just, I'm chuckling again because you can see, I mean, he's tried to sort of quite arrogantly take control of the conference and the narrative. But these journalists, and that actually was Hella asking that specific question, but other journalists in another part did jump in, totally supporting her and shouting out, answer the questions, stop avoiding the questions. Because clearly this guy has been rolled out by Modi's team to face the press. Poor guy, you've got to feel a bit sorry for him now. He's facing the might of the Western democratic press, and he just doesn't know how to handle it, and he's lost his temper. Please don't interrupt. This is my press conference. Well, sorry, mate, but this is how the democratic West works. It is a perfect example now, this, of how the Indian government operates. They want absolute control over the narrative. And when they're asked about real issues like the persecution of minorities, they try to change the subject to yoga or history. And if you push them for an answer, they try to shut you down completely. And this is why it just fell apart. It just turned into scenes of absolute chaos. And they just can't handle it. They can't deal with it. They cannot deal with a free press, primarily because they're just not used to it. In India, there isn't a free press. So the fallout really did cause quite a massive political storm. Interestingly, so even this relatively small event in Norway, in democratic Norway, has just absolutely erupted, particularly in India, because it's highlighted the failings of Indian so-called democracy. And in India itself, opposition leaders, I've got a few tweets here, just to give you an example. Opposition leaders use this footage to show that the Prime Minister Modi is terrified of unscripted questions. In other words, they really leveraged the political capital, as it's called, of this event, of this failing of Modi in front of a free press, and they're leveraging that just to highlight the fact that Modi is terrified. He will never answer unscripted questions because he might get found out. He might be held accountable. He might be asked questions that he doesn't really want to have to answer. In other words, about persecution of minorities, about the lack of free press, etc., etc. And on the other side, of course, unsurprising, the ruling party's internet cells, the IT bots, launched a massive wave of online abuse against poor Hella. Yes, anybody who dares stand up to the Indian state, particularly the RSS-driven BJP, they suddenly find themselves as a target of the IT cells and always a massive tsunami of abuse. And refer you to Callum. Remember Callum, who the Scottish vlogger who almost accidentally sort of stumbled upon this whole sort of issue, and suddenly himself was found he was being smeared across the Indian Godi media. So in other words, you dare cross the Indian states, particularly if you're here in the West, and you find your name is dragged through the mud in India. And even Hella, bless her, she was even accused of essentially being a foreign spy. You know, in other words, it's ridiculous. But that is the Godi media, and that is India. That is how India operates. Now, in this final clip, I'll show you a final clip. Hella was asked by the interviewer how she, in Norway, can hold the Indian government to account. So it was quite an interesting question. When he claims how India is a democratic country with free and fair elections, etc. So let me just play this final clip. And this speaks volumes again.
That's a great question. I think it's always going to be difficult when you're not on the ground yourselves, but I rely on international reports from Amnesty, from the Human Rights Watch. And I also, after yesterday, have received a lot of messages from many Indians around your country. That is, some of the things they're describing is truly very alarming.
Yeah, alarming is the word. There it is, alarming. She's basically, this whole event proves exactly what we discuss on the show every day. The Indian state cannot tolerate the truth. It cannot handle a truly free press. And this simple visit to Norway, as it turns out, from one of the least democratic, supposedly democratic nations on earth to one of the most democratic nations on earth, that clash created this event. That event has gone viral, and it's proved everything that we say on a daily basis here on Perspectives. I hate to say I told you so, but there you go. Anyway, well done to that lovely lady, that lovely Norwegian journalist, Hella. And good on her, and all power to her going forward. So, okay, let's move on now. And this is great news, this next story. This lady, Dr. Gunisha Kaur. Washington, D.C. This is a historic announcement that really changes things for the global Sikh community, particularly in the US. Now, Dr. Gunisha Kaur has just been officially... Oh, sorry, I beg your pardon. There we go. Me and my buttons again. It's Monday morning. I was a bit slow on my buttons on Monday morning. Dr. Gunisha Kaur, she's just been officially appointed to the US Commission on International Religious Freedoms, known as USCIRF, USCIRF. And the appointment was made by Senator Chuck Schumer. He's the top leader in the US Senate. So this is a big appointment by a big person. In other words, it's significant. Now, let's explain why this specific committee matters. USCIRF is an independent two-party federal agency. In other words, it's Democrats and the Republicans co-party this commission. And its job is to watch over human rights and religious freedom around the world. The Commission reports its findings every year directly to the US President, the Secretary of State, and the US Congress. So in other words, what it says is listened to by the top people in the US administration. And it's the first time in history that a member of the Sikh community has been chosen to serve on this commission, this really powerful commission. Dr. Kaur herself, she's not a career politician. She's actually a highly respected physician. I think she's an anaesthetist. And a human rights researcher at the same time at Weill Cornell Medicine. And crucially, she also serves on the board of NSAF, that organisation which we often refer to, that spent decades gathering evidence of historical human rights abuses and extrajudicial killings in Punjab. So she's actually been on the board of NSAF for quite some time. So she knows, as we say in English, she knows her onions, she knows her stuff. So she knows up here where all the skeletons are buried, metaphorically and almost literally speaking, in India. But it does mean, for the first time, an expert who deeply understands the history and struggles of the Sikh community now has an official seat at that highest table of American foreign policy. And there it is. This was this year's report. And it does land at a huge moment of extreme tension between Washington and Delhi. And just a couple of months ago, this report came out, its 2026 annual report, and its findings regarding India were absolutely scathing. For 7 consecutive years, the Commission has recommended that the US government place India on its official blacklist as a country of particular concern. But, so that's been a pretty consistent recommendation. But this year was different, and quite significantly different. This year's report did go much further than before, much further than ever before, and it crossed a major diplomatic red line. This is actually boink boink. I'll try and zoom in. Can I zoom in? There we go. These are the recommendations, and it says, for the first time in history, the Commission explicitly called on the American government to impose strict, targeted sanctions against 2 powerful pillars of the Indian state, the RSS and, of course, RAW. And the official report demands that the US government freeze the financial assets of these entities and place strict travel bans on their members, blocking them basically from entering the United States. This is huge. And the Commission called for these extreme measures all because of India's systematic, ongoing violations of religious freedom, both at home alongside its escalating campaign of transnational repression overseas, which obviously included tracking, harassing, targeting Sikh activists living on Western soil. So the Indian government at the time panicked when this report came out. They rejected it as biased, politically motivated. But, you can't wipe away the official findings of a US government body. It just doesn't work like that. So, Dr. Kaur's appointment, why does it matter so much? Well, it now adds massive institutional weight to the Sikh community's ongoing demands for international justice. And of course, this in itself is a pillar of the whole Khalistan movement in terms of its strategy to get Khalistan over the line. For years, the pro-Khalistan movements and global Sikh advocacy groups have been warning Western governments that India, the Indian state, uses its intelligence networks and extremist nationalist groups to terrorise its minorities, like the Sikh community. And for a long time, Western leaders just ignored those warnings. They didn't listen, primarily because they wanted to protect the wretched trade deals with New Delhi. But the narrative now is fundamentally shifting. When the global Sikh community calls for the sanctioning of Indian officials or exposes transnational oppression, it's not just coming from activists, from people like me. It's actually now potentially going to be coming from and backed by the official recommendations of the US government's own Religious Freedom Commission. In other words, it's not just activists like me, like many of you guys out there, like Sikhs for Justice, etc., out there just sort of shouting from the outside in. It's now coming from the inside itself, these same warnings to the US administration. Wake up, this is what India is up to. It is not in our democratic national interests as a nation ourselves. It is impacting on the sovereignty of the United States, and that is going to start getting more serious attention. So that's why it matters. Now, the Indian reaction, well, it's all a little bit predictable, really. Have I got? I think I had a video of India's reaction. Here we go. Let me just play a bit of this.
The Ministry of External Affairs rejected the annual report of the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom for 2026, which recommended targeted sanctions on the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh and India's Research and Analysis Wing over alleged violations of religious freedom. MEA spokesperson Randhir Jaiswal said in a statement that the Commission had continued to present what he described as a distorted and selective picture of India, relying on questionable sources and ideological narratives.
Blah, blah, blah. I mean, it's all predictable. Basically, they're totally denying it and saying it's just all anti-India sentiment. It's coming from, unreliable sources. Well, it's not. We know that. But ultimately, and what really matters here, is when you've got an expert like Dr. Angus Scott sitting on the USCIRF panel, the official focus on India's illegal actions abroad is only going to intensify. And this shift, this massive institutional shift, proves that the push for Khalistan is no longer just this local struggle in Punjab. It's now become a core topic of discussion now in those halls of power in Washington itself. In other words, the West is finally waking up to the true nature of the Indian regime. And so just this simple appointment of bless her, this lady, Dr. Kaur, I have absolutely no doubt it is really going to have a huge impact, which is great news. So anyway, we'll see. But hopefully that's going to bring out some interesting news stories over the coming year or so, and we'll be on it if they do. Right, I just want to quickly, as we wrap up, just do a few very quick stories, just covering a few things that we're just, I suppose, tying up some loose ends, as we call it. This ongoing legal case here in the UK, it was a terrible murder trial, actually, a sad situation. And it's obviously got a lot of press attention. The right wing, extremist right wing, have been all over it because it was, of course, this young Sikh who stabbed somebody who had racially abused him in a place called Southampton. The murder trial is taking place over the tragic death of, it was an 18-year-old university student, a lad called Henry Novak, and he was stabbed fatally in December last year. Now, the defendant is a 23-year-old Sikh, Vikram Digwa. The court heard the weapon involved was a 21-centimetre carbine, that's about 8 inches, And the defendant strongly denies the charge, saying it was self-defence. He alleges he was racially abused, his turban was pulled off, his hair was grabbed during a violent confrontation after a night out. And because of this high-profile nature of the trial, there's been a lot of right-wing extremist backlash. You know, why is this guy allowed in the country? I mean, it's all predictable. You've heard it all before. It's usual hate crime stuff. And so the organisations in the community have had to get together and try and issue this statement to try and calm things down. So look, let's just calm it down. The message is clear. The tragic individual case must not be used to judge or make broad assumptions about the wider Sikh community or indeed the whole Sikh faith. The statement itself, as it came out, expressed deep condolences for the family, but reminded the public that this violent incident does not align with Sikh teachings that, of course, are built entirely on compassion, peace, service, savour. So they're rightfully urging the public and the media particularly to exercise restraint and just let the judicial process proceed without any sort of prejudice. But it is a vital reminder that an isolated, complex conflict must never be weaponised to demonise a whole community. So, of course, it's very hard to defend what happened, particularly if it was indeed a kirpan that was used, because it undoes so much good work that's taken years to achieve. So, of course, the community is very much in defensive mode here. So the statement's gone out. So let's hope it does actually have a positive impact. And then finally, let's move on to a quick one just to sign off. And here we go. This is actually it's a beautiful, deeply inspiring visual to carry home with you at the end of the show. It was during the recent opening ceremony of a new Sahib. I haven't been able to I tried to find some video of this and I couldn't find any video, so maybe it doesn't exist. But I just came across this one report of it, and it's not widely reported. So again, I've only got a very small amount of information about this, but if it's true, and I believe it is, there's no reason why it wouldn't be. It was apparently an official opening ceremony of a new Sahib up in Uttarakhand in India. And the congregation witnessed this wonderful moment as the doors were opened. A magnificent falcon in this picture was captured on camera soaring above the building, directly above the building. Now, in Sikh history and tradition, the falcon is a deeply auspicious symbol. It's closely connected to the legacy of Guru Gobind Singh Ji. And this beautiful falcon flying over the community's newest home obviously made them feel it was a profound sign of protection, strength, hope for the future. And this shrine, it was Hemkunt Sahib, as it's known. Apparently it draws thousands of pilgrims every year. It's recorded in the Holy Granth Sahib that the 10th Guru of Sikhs, Guru Gobind Singh Ji, meditated by the banks of Hemkund Lake in one of his earlier births. So ultimately, it's a relatively small thing, and it reminds me, for those who remember, in the last referendum, the Khalistan referendum was it Seattle or wherever it was. At that time, there was video footage of a falcon or an eagle actually flying over the crowds as they queued to cast their vote. Again, very auspicious signs. So again, you can interpret it any way you want. It may be just a random natural event, or ultimately maybe the gurus are watching over us all. Anyway, it's just a nice story to finish on. Right, let's the clock's counting down. Let's move on to our comment section. And as always, thank you very much to my wonderful audience for all your comments, even to S Simba, who likes to dip in and have a prod whenever he gets, or he or she, could be she, whenever they get a chance. And what a wonderful language this Khalistan is using. Well done. Yes, a rather sarcastic comment. Thank you, S. Simba. Yes, indeed, it was that. And I was chuckling away, actually, I have to say, rather guiltily, with a guilty pleasure, at these Khalistani activists when they confronted the Indian Commission in Oslo in their hotel. They were shouting some fairly fruity language, as I said at the time. And yeah, okay, let's get all formal about it and say, yes, it's unjustified, bad language, blah, blah, blah. It's really not seemly, it's not a good thing. But ultimately, it was funny. And to be honest, there was only two of them. And there was a few Indian officials. Nobody really was going to get too offended by it other than the Indian officials. And I think that was the design. It was a very personal... This wasn't a big protest in front of the world's cameras. It was two guys with Khalistani flags basically having a go at some fairly unpleasant Indian officials. I don't blame them. And sometimes bad language is justified. And I would actually say yes, Sim, but I think in this situation it probably was. And also, it did make it very, very funny indeed. So there you go. Sikh. Yes, we had lots of reactions, of course, to Hella's question and the whole situation that unfolded. It was great. Sukhar Singh, the Western media are finally talking about what we need to talk about. It's about time. It's about time we talked about India's Hindutva trashing humanity, destroying everything. Exactly what's going on. Stay safe, likewise. Yeah, Modi went across to see Melody, as you call her. We hope that the Italian media would follow suit. Actually, they didn't. Nothing interesting came out of Italy, I have to say, rather disappointingly. But ultimately, as you say, Indians can retire the whole act and send the clowns home. It is indeed, that's the right metaphor, because they are a circus. It is an absolute circus that's come out of India into the West. And they've met an audience that is actually quite critical. And I think they didn't really know how to handle it, which is actually rather good news. So, Happy sums it up perfectly, I would say. India's the biggest fake democracy ever. I don't think I can add to that point, really. WHO Panzer. I did, hopefully, hit the nail on the head. Running from real reporters and valid questions. Why? Well, as you say, India isn't democratic. It is a distorted form of democracy. They're controlling the narrative. They've got bureaucrats that they present to the world. But, well, you describe it in all sorts of different ways. As you say, pick your own word. We all know what it's all about. You could write a whole book, as you say, about this fake illusion of democracy in India. And basically, it gives me enough material to talk day after day after day about it, because that is how fake the Indian democracy is. So thank you, WHO Panzer. You yourself hit the nail on the head. Nirmal Singh, in Australia, welcome, good day. You know what the answer is. You tell us regularly, because you're absolutely right. And you must keep telling us and keep reminding the world there is only one answer. It is, of course, Khalistan. The press freedom in India is a laughing stock. It is. We laugh at it. It would be funny if it actually wasn't so serious. But as you say, democracy is actually the biggest BS in the world. And Mohinder Singh, again, sums it up beautifully with 3 emojis after the name Modi. Again, I couldn't put it more clearly myself, or more succinctly. Punjab, our resident warrior, comes in with, and I had to again cut down a very lengthy, very detailed, very interesting comment. Thank you, Punjab, as always. This is about this Biadbi Act, and I did go into detail last week about this dangerous Trojan horse, really, of an act that is designed, and Punjab comes and explains in great detail how you believe it's going to be used. For example, they planned the acts of Biadbi over years, knowing that one day that Sikhs will demand an act under the Hindu law. It's called problem, reaction, solution. If you want something to happen, you create a problem so that people then demand a solution, which of course is the solution you wanted to impose upon them in the first place. So this is a classic example, is that the RSS Hindutva planned all these acts of Biadbi, knowing that the Sikhs would then react. So you've got to do something about it. You've got to enact it in law. Okay, here's our law, which in effect is a Trojan horse. So they knew exactly what was going on here. And you talk about the Kezadari Hindus working for the RSS, going around looking for Sikhs who might have old Guru Granth Sahib Jis and accuse them of Biadbi, blackmail them to get old copies. And once they take control of it, then once they have control, they can rewrite it. And this is really the crux of this, is to get the Sikhs away from the Bani. It's a long-term plan. And you believe, essentially, it's going to be almost Orwellian. In other words, they will rewrite history. They will rewrite the Guru Granth Sahib Ji in their own form, so that when Sikhs read the Guru Granth Sahib Ji, they don't know, are these the true words of the Gurus, or are they actually this completely manufactured version by those who now control the Holy Scriptures? That is a dangerous situation to be in. But anyway, the second part of your comment And this is where good old warrior Punjab sort of strides out once again, wielding your sword and your kirpan in abject outrage, justifiable outrage, I have to say. There is only one solution. We need real gurus. They can save their lives today, but death will come one day. Choosing this, they will hand over the guru to the ones who are hell-bent on destroying the path of Sikhi. Choose the path of Shahidi. Well, this is where Punjab and this is where we do diverge in our opinions in terms of how we go forward with this, because you are absolutely clearly decided that the only path is to avoid this, as you call it, gutless cowardice, and be more valiant, be heroic, basically be a true Sikh warrior. Remember your Sikh heritage, stand up and fight, even if it means losing your life. And you've got to talk, got to act now. No more talk, no more speeches. We need to stand up and fight physically, essentially, is your message. But again, this is where we differ. I totally understand it, and I do agree with it to a large extent. But we have to be, and as I keep saying this over again, we have to be intelligent how we do this to win the war. We have to pick the battles that we can win. A classic tactic of the British Army is you only fight battles where you outnumber the enemy 3-1, because that way you're almost guaranteed winning. If you don't tick that box, you walk away to fight another day. In other words, pick your battles, and only the battles that you know you can win, because otherwise you probably lose and you'll lose the war. And this is one of those situations. Pick your battles. You cannot beat India physically. You cannot defeat India through violence. India is huge. It has one of the biggest armies on the planet. It has trillions of dollars of resources. It controls every element of life in India, as we talk about regularly. You cannot beat that. The 1980s and 90s prove that. The heroic Shaheeds from the 80s and 90s did this very thing. They stood up to fight it, and they couldn't defeat it. And they lost their lives in their droves, because that was a battle they could not physically win. They just did not have enough numbers. And now we do not have enough numbers to physically win a battle against India. But what we can win is, I know it's painful and it's tedious and it requires patience, but we can win through the rule of law and democratic battling. And the proof is the whole Khalistan movement is winning, as I talk about regularly. And yeah, there may come one day, when we need to pick up our kirpans and charge, crying, Bole so Nihal. I look forward to that day. If it ever comes, I will join you, shoulder to shoulder. But ultimately, that day is not today. Today is the democratic battle. Today is winning the war through democracy, because it's winning. It's working. So thank you, Punjab. I totally align with your feelings. I understand them. I'm sure many people in the audience do. But there is no point sacrificing your life in a battle that you will not win. It's a pointless loss of life. Choose your battles. This is not the battle this time. And final set. Thank you to all of you for your lovely comments. There have been some really nice comments. GSG Human. Great job, bro. Love your show. Well, thank you. I love your comment. That's much appreciated. Really, I say loads of comments like this, so thank you. It is appreciated. It does help me. You know, it motivates me to get up every morning at the crack of dawn, like I do, to record the show. So it does give me a nice personal boost. So thank you for that. Much appreciated. Uncanny Wizard, Road to Freedom. Yes, we are running down that road to freedom. And coming the other way is the Khalistan Express, which we're just about to hop on board. It is indeed the road to freedom. It is the road to Khalistan that we're on. And as Sukha Singh and Universal Respect in Punjabi says, Khalistan Zindabad. Indeed, it's on the way, as I say to Punjab. Don't worry, mate. We're winning the war. It is happening. Just be patient. Just keep doing what we're doing. Keep putting one foot in front of the other, metaphorically speaking, on this path towards Khalistan. Keep being active. Keep getting out in the streets. Keep flying the Khalistan flags. Keep highlighting India's misbehaviour, its illegal activities, because all these approaches, this huge multilateral attack, is winning the war. It is slow. It is just literally incremental steps. But each incremental step is unmovable, immutable. It means India can't push back because it is that solid. And it's like a creeping tide of concrete that's just going to literally drive the Hindutva forces back and further back, and there's nothing they can do. It is slow. It is absolutely unavoidable. So anyway, that is it for another day. I must wrap the show up today. Do keep your comments coming. Thank you all of you who contributed. Don't forget you can message me at satlegetv.com. Thank you to each of you for sending me all sorts of links. One of you particularly, and apologies if I don't respond to every single email. You know I do read them. Thank you for this. But do keep the links coming of stories you want me to cover, or interesting things that you see on social media or whatever, that I can then research and see if there's a real story that needs to be told to you guys about. So keep those coming in. But that is it for another day. Thanks so much for watching. Have a great day. God willing, I will see you tomorrow.